For the latest in our series of interviews for UK Cigar Scene, I'm delighted to welcome the Managing Director of Hunters Frankau, Jemma Freeman. Jemma, welcome.
Thank you, Nick.
And in June this year, Hunters Frankau are going to be celebrating the 225th anniversary of the company, a momentous occasion. Tell us a little about, if we go back, way back to 1790, tell us a little about the origins of the business way back then.
Well, Hunters Frankau is really the story of three families. So the only way to go back to the beginning is to look at each strand individually.
Right.
So there was John Hunter, who established his business in 1790, and that business ran all the way through to the 50s when my family bought the Hunter business.
Right.
And then there was another family run by Joseph Frankau, and the Frankau business ran from the 1840s all the way through to the 1930s in various different names,
right.
Again until my grandfather bought that business in the 1930s. And then there was Freeman's. And Freeman's was established by my great-great-great-grandfather, James Rakers Freeman. And again, that was in the we think that was around about 1839. And they were initially involved in the manufacturing of cigars. And that company went on to buy, first of all, Frankau and then Hunter. And that was how Hunters Frankau came about.
And then come together. Wonderful. When I was just thinking about when you go out to visit Cuba, that history must count when you visit Cuba, doesn't it? Do they look back on or look at you from that point of view?
I think some of them do in Cuba, and I think people who are interested in history are always fascinated to know that we're still in business. We must have been going out to Cuba now for, you know, an extremely long time, 150 years, my family,
right.
Let alone the Francaus or the Upmans or the Hunters. But I think because of the situation in Cuba, there was obviously a revision of history after the big event in the 1950s, when all the Cuban factories and everything were nationalized. So quite a lot of history was lost at that point in many ways. But I think what we find is even now, 2014, within Hunters Frankau, there are a few people in that company who've been going to Cuba for 20, 30, 40 years in some cases.
Yeah.
And so we've built up a lot of long-standing relationships, and there's a lot of history between us and certain people. But I think like any other business, people move around. So you might know the head of a factory for a few years and build up a good relationship with him, and he could be someone that's interested in history, so you have a particularly good relationship, and he might move on and someone new will come in.
Right.
But I think in terms of our relationship with Habanos now, our history has stood us in really good stead. We are a market that has faced as many challenges as any other market I can think of, right back to a long period where we couldn't import Cuban cigars over, during, beyond the Second World War, right up to the last sort of 10 years since I've been in the business, where we've been dealing with a sort of onslaught of legislation. And despite all of that, Hunters Frankau and the English market rallies on.
Yes.
And we still are known for having some of the greatest shops in the world here in London. You just have to be here in St James's to go up, and you've got three of the great retailers, in the world at the moment, sitting on our doorstep. So I think that for Cuba really matters, is that we continue to be entirely loyal to Cuban cigars, and we continue to do whatever we can, not just us, but the consumer, the retailers, the hotels and restaurants, continue to tell everybody about Cuban cigars and remain entirely committed to them.
So, from thinking about now going back to sort of to your family,
yes.
And your what generation of your family are you now?
I'm sixth generation.
Sixth generation.
And so when we first started in tobacco, my great grandfather James, we understand that he married a lady from Holland whose family were in the tobacco business. And he went over to Holland to learn how to make cigars. And he came back and he set up a business in Hoxton, which was originally involved in retail and the manufacturing of cigars. And that grew and grew and grew till they had a factory in Hoxton. And they then moved, or they set up a second factory in Cardiff. And that became an enormous factory. I mean, by the time we sold that business 100 years later, they were making 70 million cigars.
Wow.
So they were considered to be the sort of second biggest manufacturer of cigars in England. And so there was the manufacturing side of the business, and then there was the Cuban side of the business. And that really started when we bought the Franco business in the 30s. And at that point we inherited the H. Upman factory, which was part of the Franco business.
Right.
And that was how we developed the relationship with Cuba and became importers of Cuban cigars.
Right.
And so that has continued on until today, where now we remain the importer for Cuban cigars in the UK. Although the business has grown, because then it was only one or two brands.
Right.
So from the sort of 50s up to the 90s, we went from having one brand to really ending up with the entire portfolio of Cuban cigars.
And the period, what was the period when the company owned the Ramon Allones brand? Because that came through the company as well.
Well, it was Hunters that owned Ramon Allones.
Right.
So Hunters bought Ramon Allones in 1911, and then they sold that back to a Cuban in 1927. So
right.
There was a period from 1911 to 1927 when Hunters owned Ramon Allones.
Right, right. Wow. And from your point of view, what's your earliest memory of the cigar business?
I was thinking about this. I can't remember being conscious of cigars as being a business when I grew up.
Right.
Cigars were just everywhere. I was trying to think of a time where I can't remember either having cigars on every surface. My father smoked cigars every evening when he got home. There was always a conversation in our house about ash being good for the carpet. I can remember that from a really young age. My mother saying, I don't understand why you can't just put it in an ashtray. I put ashtrays everywhere. And him saying, I don't know, a little bit's good for the carpets. And every drawer you opened in our house had tubes rolling around in it. And everywhere you went you could find a cigar or a cutter or a lighter, and there was a lot of, paraphernalia around. My father was always given beautiful gifts. We had lovely, lovely sort of cigar memorabilia around the house. And also he was a very social man. So our house was always filled with people from various parts of the world with whom he was doing business, cigar business, because for a time we did business with Jamaica, there was business with some Americans, there was business, Davidoff business, and then the Cubans. So most weekends you'd sit down to Sunday lunch and you'd be introduced to, someone from Davidoff and someone's here from Jamaica, and everybody was friends. It didn't feel like work.
Right.
It was just,
right.
It was absolutely part of the sort of substance of our lives. So I can't remember not being around cigars. And I remember when Agio launched Maharis, I remember great excitement in our house because we were the Agio distributor then. Piles of Maharis everywhere and everyone trying these little cheroots, going, oh yes, aren't these wonderful, lovely flavours? And everything new that came through the drawing room. So I don't remember cigars not being around.
Was it a logical then that you would come into the business?
No. That was never the plan. My father was definitely someone that I'm not sure it would have occurred to him that to pass the family business on to his daughter when
right.
he had a son. And so it was my brother who was groomed for the business. He was sent to Cuba for 6 months, where he worked in the fields for 3 months. He worked in the Upman factory for months. He went to Spain, and he was in Spain at the time working for, it was Altardis, it had just become Altardis when my father died. and he just left university, so he was terribly young, and he didn't feel that he wanted to give up his training in Spain at that point and come back to England and go straight into the cigar business.
Right.
And I was working in advertising. I have the similar background to Simon for a short amount of time, but both of us have a background in brands and marketing. And it was a good point for me to have a change.
Right.
And so as a family, we thought, well, I could go into the business as a sort of stopgap until my brother was finished in Spain. Yeah. And then the idea was I would go out again and he would come in. And that's not how it ended up. I mean, I got there. I had worked in cigar shops. I'd had holiday jobs before. Okay. I'd worked for Robert Emery at J.J. Fox. I'd worked for Jean Clark in Harrods. I had taken a couple of rollers around for my father in the summer holidays. So I'd sort of had the most tiny amount of experience. And I arrived at Hunters and I went to work for Simon initially. And we were working on the health warning legislation had just come in, which was a pretty depressing piece of law because you had to suddenly take all your beautiful boxes that had had very small health warnings and suddenly put these big, ugly health warnings on. And also the logistics of it. You can imagine how many hundreds of different pack sizes. And so that was my first job, and I got hooked. I mean, that was it. I realised after about 6 months that the chances of me leaving were very, very small. I really loved it. It was interesting and exciting and really hard. I mean, it was difficult work. And my brother then joined the business for about 2 or 3 years, about 3 years later. And he was brilliant. I mean, people still remember him. He was charming and sort of a bon vivant like my father was. But he didn't want to stay in the cigar business. He wanted to become a musician. That had always been his thing, was music. So after 2 or 3 years, he just said, "You're fine, I'm off." And that was it. So I've been there ever since. And actually, as much as I would have loved to have done it with him, it's been a real adventure being in that business. And yeah, I enjoy it, every single day of it.
Wonderful, wonderful. And then you set to with a project to celebrate the 225th anniversary.
Yes.
And we're sitting here now with the culmination of it. Well, when did the project actually start? When did you start?
Well, I can't remember at what point someone said, "Do you realise we've got our 225th anniversary coming up?" But it was probably around about 2010 or 11 that we started to think about the fact that if we wanted to really do something in 2015, we needed to start the planning process then. And obviously the first thing we thought about is, let's create a cigar. Let's create something that reflects our history and that we could have available in the year of our anniversary. And the two brands that we really looked at were Upmann, given the history we had with Upmann, and Ramon Allones. And Upmann we had used for our 200th anniversary, and I would have loved to have used Upmann. It really did belong to my family for a couple of years, and there's there are great stories around the selling of that factory and everything back to the Cubans. But Ramon Allones was the brand we chose because Ramon Allones in our office is our sort of most favourite cigar. Everybody loves the Ramon Allones Specially Selected. You know, the chairman, Simon, Philip, we all have a real love of the Ramon Allones Specially Selected. And so we talked to Cuba about making us a cigar, and we were given permission to come up with some ideas. And so we went back through the archives and we found that, back in the day, there was a sort of form of Ramon Allones, with a cabeza tumbada, as we call it, which is like a dropped head. So it's not a flat head and it's not a pyramidus. It's somewhere halfway between.
Okay.
And it's a very rarely made cigar now. And we thought that'll be nice. So we had the shape and we had the brand, and then we thought about how we could present the cigar. And that was when we had the idea to create the Humidor as well. And so going back to the cigar, the next sort of stage, once we had approval, and we got approval in about 2011 from Cuba, we decided on a quantity. We decided to make 50,000. And I went to Cuba for the first time in 2011, in November, I was with Edward Saharkin and no, sorry, it wasn't 2011, it was 2012. I was with Edward Saharkin and Nick Fuchs, and we were going out to do a piece for the FT. And we went out there in November, and we've been going in November for a couple of years. And there are certain periods in Cuba where all the factories send their tasting panels. Each factory has a panel, 4 or 5 people who are responsible for constantly testing the cigars. And what they do is each factory sends their panel to a pre-designated place. So in this case, we were in the Nacional Hotel in the big bar at the back, indoors. So there were about 100 of the tasters from all the factories in Cuba. And what they do at these panels, they hold them once a week on a Friday, is they blind taste a cigar. And the way it works is they hand out a cigar, you don't know what it is, on a tray. It's got a little white band around it with a 3-digit number, and you smoke the cigar. And then they hand around a second cigar, identical, except it's got a different 3-digit number, and you smoke that cigar, and you smoke the 2, and you've got 2 bits of paper, and you're asked to you know, talk about its appearance, its draw, its combustibility, has it been rolled well, you know, all the sort of typical measures for a factory to make sure that they've made a good cigar. And I realised when they brought the second cigar round, because it had a cabeza tumbada, that we were trying our regional edition. So there we were, and trying the regional edition with the whole panel of 100 tasters. And you're not allowed to get involved in the blend, because the blend is the Ramon Allones blend.
Right.
But what you can talk about is whether you feel it's strong or medium or full flavoured. So we were asked to give our feedback on that. And then we were told what the cigar was, which was great excitement. And a man called Hosniel came up and introduced himself, and he'd been the man at the Partagas factory who'd made the first batch. So then we went to the Partagas factory. We went to meet Vishot, who's the master blender. He told us about all the work he'd done on the cigar. He'd selected, the blend very carefully. He wanted it to be exactly right for the size and the shape of the cigar. So having tasted 2 at the tasting panel, they were both good, and one was slightly more Ramon Allones than the other. So when we got to vote, we voted for the one that had the 6 in it, or whatever the digit was. And then the next time I went out was after the cigars had been delivered. So the cigars were then delivered in 2013. They were made in February and June. That's the date codes that are on the bottom of the box. And they were all shipped over that summer. So part of the idea was to keep them in London, England, and age them for a couple of years, because that is the traditional way of selling cigars in this country. It used to be that retailers would do that aging process, but it's become much, much less typical now, because it's the way the business works. You don't really have the opportunity so often to age a cigar. You want to get it in front of people as quickly as possible. So they arrived in 2013. We didn't really touch them in 2013. And then I went back to Cuba again with 2 boxes of them at the end of 2013. Was it 2014? No, it's 2014 I took them back, with a journalist from the Sunday Times, because we were doing an article about a rum that's been made by Havana Club, specially blended to go with this cigar.
Right.
So they wanted us to go back out to Cuba to do some tastings. They had a couple of final blends for the rum. So we took 2 boxes of these cigars back to Cuba. We went back to the Partagas factory. We went to see Vishot, and we went to see the team who'd made the cigar. And we sat down with them, and it was then that we learned that they'd given the entire production to 3 rollers. Only 3 people made the 50,000 cigars,
right.
which was an amazing thing to hear.
Yeah.
And they had the 3 rollers there, and one of them was Jemmas, who's been here in London before,
yes.
and we're hoping will come back again. So we saw the 3 rollers, we had the cigar, and we sat in the tasting room at the Partagas factory, and we smoked the Ramon Allones, that had by then been in London for nearly 18 months. And the best moment for me was there's a lady who works there called Odelaine, who's the head of their tasting panel. And she said, I must have tried 40 of these while we were making them. And she said, I've never had a cigar that's left the factory and gone somewhere else and then come back again.
Right.
And we had such a wonderful conversation with her about how it had evolved, because she had a very similar response to it than we had had smoking it a few times in between, which is that it had started off as a very, very strong cigar, and that actually it has mellowed over the period of resting. And she said, it has reached for me a very unusual point in a cigar where the strength and the aroma are not fighting each other. They're just absolutely in parallel. And she just stood there with a great smile on her face, saying, and I could see for her, it was a moment of real pride that this cigar that they had put so much work and effort, and they really had, they really took this cigar very, very seriously, had come back to them for a little visit.
Yes.
And was everything they had hoped it would be. So that's really the story of the cigar and the evolution of the cigar. And then the humidor, well, we decided to do a humidor. We decided that 225 of them was probably the right amount, although we were a bit nervous about such a large quantity. And we wanted to do a humidor that reflected some of the history of not only our company, but also to do with the history of how cigars were transported. And the way cigars used to be transported was in cabinets that looked similar to this, but on a much bigger scale. So if you were ordering your cigars for Cuba, you'd order a cabinet selection of 10,000
right.
H. Upmanns, or 2,000 or 4,000. And so the humidor is where the word, or that style of transporting cigars is where the word cabinet selection originally comes from.
Right.
And then what the Cubans did was wrote cabinet selection onto boxes that were to go into those cabinets. So actually cabinet selection really describes the kind of packing case,
I see.
not the way that the cigars are packed within each individual box.
Right.
And we had lots of pictures of old cabinets, and we went to see Mitch Orchant, who's got a collection of old cabinets, and Edward's got a couple in the Davidoff shop. And so that was our general idea for the humidor.
Right.
And then we employed Massimo from De Art in Italy, in Milan, who has been making beautiful humidors in London for the last 4 years. And we asked him if he'd be interested in doing the project, and he said yes. And after that we spent 2 years going backwards and forwards between Milan and London until we got a humidor that we felt was exactly fine-tuning. And it has changed since we thought about it, but not enormously. I mean, we've added some details, like the humidor at the top was an idea we had for people that wanted to store some loose cigars.
Right.
It was actually Edward that said to us, has it got some colour on the humidor? At which point we thought we should introduce some colour to it, which we've done by creating a plaque with the Ramon Allones logo on it. And they'll be, they're each numbered. I'm having to sign them all, which is a great privilege, but also it's quite challenging in terms of how you sign each of these, but we've got there in the end.
Right.
And each humidor's got 4 boxes of cigars in it, so 100 cigars in each humidor.
Beautiful. And this is number 1.
This is number 1, and this was the first one to be shipped. We've since received all the humidors.
Right.
And I went to the factory just before they were about to start shipping, but they were still producing a few of the cigars, I mean the humidors. And Massimo took me through the factory and showed me every process that they'd gone through, right from where he had kept the cedar that he specially selected. So he went out and bought the cedar personally. He knew which big planks he wanted, so that we could get as much consistency of colour as possible. And the amount of work that has gone into these humidors is almost sort of parallel to the amount of work that goes into a cigar. Every single bit of it has been made by hand. It's been put together by hand. You know, I watched all of these being sort of lovingly put on, all the screws, all the handles. It's a huge amount of work has gone into that by day art.
And the one thing that you can't appreciate on the video is how gorgeous it smells too.
It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well, it's because it's pure cedar, and there has been, I mean, apart from
and
a
it's
little
raw
bit
too.
of
It's not varnished or
we looked at
finished in any
varnishing
way.
the humidor, and actually we went through a process of trying out varnishes, and we just felt that it lost some of its soul when it was varnished.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of letting something age naturally.
Yeah.
And I love the idea that the boxes and the humidor are so similar. You know, cedar from Cuba and you know, the cedar of the humidor. So for me that was it was a big decision, but looking at the humidors now, I'm glad we didn't varnish them.
It's quite beautiful, really beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you.
And I'm sure they're going to be snapped up. What with the history, the provenance, and the cigars as well.
Yes.
I'm sure they'll be hugely successful.
Oh well, I hope so. I mean, we made them with consumers in mind, and I hope we've made something that people would like to have in their homes.
I'm sure they will. Wonderful, Jemma. That's marvellous, and thank you so much for bringing it down. It's and introducing it to us. That's marvellous.
Well, it's
really
the first
great.
time it's left its office. I mean, it's left our office, so it looks quite happy to be here.
It does. No, it looks, yes, in its element.
In its element. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Lovely. Well, we're going to finish the interview now with the three standard questions that we always finish with. So, number one, your favourite place to actually smoke a cigar. Where do you?
I'm not sure I'm going to give you the most original answer. I've got two places I like to smoke a cigar.
Right.
One is the first evening that I ever arrive in Havana, and there's something about getting to Cuba. It's almost the moment you step off the aeroplane, you start thinking about having a cigar. There's something about the air and the atmosphere. And that first evening when you've had a long flight, got to your hotel, got changed, go downstairs, you go out for dinner. And for me, it's when your first dinner with your friends you haven't seen for a while, and everybody takes out their cigars. And you sit there with a drink and some food and your friends on a Cuban evening. That for me is the greatest. And it doesn't particularly matter where exactly it is in Havana, it's just about it being that first evening.
Night. Lovely.
And the other place I love having a cigar is outside Franco's, top of St. James's. It's a great spot to smoke a cigar, and I like sitting there and watching the world go by. I love looking into the windows of the Davidoff shop and seeing people go in, be looked after by the staff in the Davidoff shop, come out with their bag of cigars. You might know a couple of them. And occasionally Edward will be there, and he'll sit there and we'll set the world to rights.
Yeah.
And I've had some wonderful cigars sitting outside Franco's.
It's a great spot, no doubt at all. And when you're smoking a cigar, what do you like to drink with the cigar? What's your tipple of choice?
Sort of depends what time of day it is. If it's a late morning cigar and it's an occasion, I love a glass of champagne. I think that is a sort of creating the environment of you're looking forward to your cigars, a delicious glass of champagne, off you go. In the evening I love a whiskey, particularly a whiskey sour with a cigar. That I found is for me a really good drink. It's a long drink. Yeah. I like a whiskey sour made with a bourbon or a sweeter whiskey, so I like that sweetness. And a good whiskey sour and a good cigar.
Interesting. Oh, wonderful.
Is a great combination.
And finally, and I know this is a really hard one, but the finest, or maybe the most memorable cigar that you ever smoked?
I remember the cigar that when I smoked it, I suddenly understood why people fall in love with cigars. And it was at Dunhill, when Dunhill was still on Jermyn Street.
Right, yes.
And they had a party, and I was given a Trinidad Fundadoras, which, you know, this was 10, 15 years ago, when we didn't really have the big fat cigars that we had now, but it was still a big, very long cigar. And there was something about that cigar, it was just perfect. I don't remember anything about the party. I remember almost just wanting to be left alone.
Yes.
So I could just smoke this extraordinary cigar. It was just smooth and elegant, enough spice in it that you wanted to keep smoking it. And that was when I fell in love with the Trinidad brand, which has been my absolute go-to cigar ever since.
Wonderful. Wonderful, I love that. Don't remember the party, but remember the cigar. Fantastic. Lovely. Jemma, that's been absolutely marvellous. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for introducing us. And we'll look forward to the next 225 years.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you.
Lovely.